Well, hello, good morning. Welcome to the second to last section of James. We're almost way through this book, so I'm excited to get through these next 2 weeks. There's still a lot of really great material to get to. So if you want to grab a Bible and turn to James 4, we're going to be looking at two sections. We're going to be looking at boasting about tomorrow and then warning to the rich. So we'll start in James chapter 4:13. So James writes in this section, he says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go into such and such a town and spend the year there and trade and make profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him is sin." So in these two sections we're going to look at, so most of your Bibles probably say boasting about tomorrow and warning to the rich. You'll notice that James starts these sections the same way. At least in the ESV it says come now. Some translations will say listen up. So he's signaling a certain kind of group, almost in the patterns you see in some of those other epistles in Paul. He's going to speak to children. He's going to speak to husbands and wives. James has some application. He's going to think of these specific groups. So he's specifically calling out merchants, people who go around from town to town. But I don't think that that's limited to merchants. So if you're not a merchant, I don't think you should tune this section out. There's still a lot of things to learn. But he's thinking about merchants in general, and he's making application to a kind of boasting that we're really all capable of doing, but he kind of picks on merchants as an example of this tendency to boast about tomorrow in a way that does not consider God. And there's an arrogance in actually assuming that we know what will happen tomorrow. As I've been saying, James very often quotes the Old Testament indirectly. You can think of Proverbs 27:1, which says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day will bring." So there's this sense in which it's arrogant, but it's also foolish, right? We don't actually know what's going to happen. And there's actually a really wise person knows that and has this bigger perspective in life and knows that at any time things could change. That's just some ways it's common sense, but I think in the Bible's, in a biblical sense, it's wise. And what are the kinds of things that can happen? Well, funny enough, with this James class, I taught one class in person, and then the next week, everything got shut down with COVID, right? I prepared for week 2 and everything got shut down. Well, and I don't know if I said anything of saying like, oh, well, when I meet for James 2, I probably said that without saying Lord willing. But there's a kind of day-to-day talking that just assumes that things are going to go on normal when they're not. Things are unstable. And even though God is in control, our plans can change very quickly. So what are the kinds of things that can change? I think that James kind of has in mind specifically the fact that we are a vapor and that our time on the earth is short. So death is obviously an obvious example. Well, we also know that Christ could return at any moment, and that could change things. Suddenly you think you're going to go into town, and then suddenly that's all over. And so there's a kind of eternal perspective that we are supposed to have. But there's other things that happen in life, right? I mentioned COVID, but you can have car accidents, you can have hospitalizations, all kinds of things can happen. Again, they're under God's control. And we have an arrogance that just assumes things are just going to go the way we expect them. There's nothing unusual is going to happen. All is well, and I'm going to make a profit. I'm actually going to boast about it as if I know better what's going to happen. And the opposite of this kind of arrogance that James says is the submission to the sovereign rule. And now it's not chance or karma, right? It's not a kind of, well, hopefully things will all work out. It's actually submitting yourself to the plan of God so that when these things happen, they're accordance to God's plans, which are unknown to us and we must submit ourselves to. So let me ask this question then. Why is it evil to boast about tomorrow? that almost seems like it seems kind of harsh. Is it really evil? I mean, you can imagine boasting to a person in a kind of prideful way, telling them how much money you made this year, or telling them about, I'm going to retire at this age, my 401k is at this stage, and all the assets are in this. There's a kind of boasting and there's a kind of arrogance, but I think that this is a kind of personalized, internal propping up of this greed and this thinking about your plans that you are the master of, right? And that you are totally in control of. And James says the antidote for he says it's evil. It's a form of evil to think that. And it's arrogant. But that the antidote is to instead say that if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. So it's this constant submission and recognition that God is the one that's in control, and that if I am hindered from doing these things, it's because of God. Again, I don't think James is saying not to plan. It's not that plans are bad. It's not bad to plan for yourself financially and to work, but there's a way that we work where there's a certain kind of shock when things don't go our way, because we expect things to be in a certain place and we don't expect our plans to be hindered. Well, for the person that has either an internal perspective or just has this understanding that all things work out for good and all things are ordered by a God who never makes a mistake, we aren't shocked by those things. We aren't shocked by a change of plan. We laugh it off and say, "Oh, this is God's plan and I'm going to follow it." It doesn't mean that there aren't awful things that happen that we can weep over and that we can work to change and improve, but there's this understanding that God is in control and God is sovereign. Let me ask this question then. What would it look like for you to bring your life under the will of God? I don't think we should be paralyzed by this truth. I think sometimes I've seen Christians have a kind of way of speaking where, it's just like, well, if God wills, as if it's this magical incantation that if we just kind of say it, well, I think that the idea here is that, we need to know God's will. There's a will in the sense of right and wrong, I think. There's a sense in which we should know what God wants for our lives, the way he wants us to live. That's God's will for your life. God's will for your life is not a secret thing that we have to figure out, as though if I, pray hard enough, I'm going to have this prophetic, vision, or a hand is going to appear and tell me which job to take or which person to marry. I don't think it's like that. But I think that it really is this recognition that God is the one who is ordering my life. I have to take those steps in faith and I have to follow his law and I have to live in submission to God as Jesus' disciple. And it's this ever submitting my own life to God. You think of the hymn, "Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee." So I think that's the picture that James has in mind. Not that we don't make money or plan, but that when we make plans, we put them under the lordship of God. So that's most of, I think, what I want to say there. And I think lastly, there's this little verse that seems almost out of place. You wonder which section it belongs in, where James says, "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him is sin." So it kind of doesn't fit. So I don't know if he's specifically calling out this attitude. So, if you are arrogant and you know that that's wrong, for you it's sin. In some ways, this verse is a little bit, almost seems to be he's jumping back into another little phrase, maybe to divide these two sections up. But I think it does kind of call attention to something, that we shouldn't do things that we think are wrong. And that there is a idea that, Romans 14:23, but that which does not proceed from faith is sin. And if we think about what our convictions are, and do we actually follow them? If you were to, I like the illustration I hear, if somebody was to walk around, or supposing this was an invisible microphone was held to your mouth, and every time you made an ought statement, it recorded it. You say, well, this should happen. Somebody should do this. I hate it when it's, and then if that was to play back to you the end of your life, how many of those rules would you probably break? There is a kind of judgment that comes on us when we know what we're supposed to do and we fail to do it. Again, I don't know where that's supposed to kind of fit into James' general argument, but that's where that verse is. So those are some of the thoughts on boasting about tomorrow. Let's jump over to 5:1. I'll read these verses, 1 through 6. Now James James pulls out all the stops for this. So buckle up. He says, "Come now, you rich, and weep. Howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotten, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." Whoa. So James really hits us hard with this section. But I think, again, he starts with this saying, he's pointing to another group. And I think James is doing something interesting here in that I think, and most of the commentaries would say, that James might not be talking to Christians here. It seems as though James is doing something where he's turning in a general sense to the people that are oppressing his audience. And you wonder why he would do that. Well, Calvin's commentary offers two suggestions. And one is he is helping the poor to see that the rich that they might covet, they might envy, are actually not well off in a real true sense. They actually, look, their robes are moth-eaten. Look, their gold is actually corrupt, and there's a judgment coming for these people. And so, lest we be tempted to think that the rich have it made, we actually should have our perspectives changed to see that they're actually not well off in God's eyes. And there's actually judgment coming to them. Why would we want that? And then two, the second reason is that it does actually help us to point to, lest you think about frauding your neighbor. Lest you live in this kind of luxury and fattening your hearts in the day. It's still a warning that I think applies to Christians, even though I think in a lot of ways it's aimed at non-believers, and it's a sense in which I think gives us comfort, because actually when we are being oppressed by the rich, it's helpful to know that God is not going to let any sin go unpunished. And he's actually counting every time that money is used against, every time that people are brought into court by the rich and they're persecuted. God knows every time. There might not be judgment now, but there's judgment in the future. It's a judgment that's kind of going on now, as we'll see in the language. And very often in the Bible, the rich and poor analogy is very often used as a kind of way of summarizing all unrighteousness. So it's not that neglecting the poor is the greatest sin, but it's very often in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, it's a way of describing all unrighteousness. And there's a sense why being rich and neglecting the poor is almost a shorthand for all kinds of unrighteousness, whereas the poor who trust God are kind of a picture of all forms of righteousness. And there's some sense in which it's true that God chooses the poor and he chooses the lowly to shame the rich, and that which has been accepted by the world. But it's also just sort of I think it's a shorthand for the kind of pattern that we see throughout the Bible and in salvation. Now there's 3 possessions and then 3 outcomes. So he calls out in verse 2, your riches have rotten, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be used as evidence against you. Now there's 3 clauses for you grammar junkies that are written in the present perfect. So they're not so much something that's going to just happen in the future, but it's something that is happening now that is carrying into the future. And again, this is I think this idea where James is helping his readers see that even though the rich seem like they're doing well, in a real spiritual sense, in that most true sense of being well off, they're actually not well off, right? Their robes are moth-eaten. I don't know if you've ever seen a moth-eaten robe, but apparently, I've been told, robes can actually be so corroded that they can actually stay in a closet for years. And if you open them, if you were to just touch them, they would all just collapse, right? That's the picture that James uses. He's very vivid in this section. And so again, the things that we might covet, the rich that have the best cars, the best clothes, and the best investments, that all is going to get wiped away. It's vanity to pursue those things because they're all going to be taken in a moment's notice. Again, it kind of connects to the last section in that we're just a vapor. We don't know what we're going to do tomorrow. Tomorrow we could die. Tomorrow Christ could return. And actually, there's a very true sense. You think about Jesus as it's foolish to lay up your treasures on earth, because not only will they all be taken from you, right? I talked about this in a previous section, but very often those things get ruined in this life, right? Our cars break down. I just had a really high car payment that I was really sad to see, but things break down, right? Our clothes rip, and the government will take our money very often. And so it's vanity to actually pursue those things. So very often, even in this life, they're taken. And they certainly cannot be taken with us after this life. And it's just, this underlines the kind of foolishness of seeking wealth and to build these things for ourselves. And actually, the purpose of these things, I don't think that's actually saying that all possessions are bad. It's the misuse of wealth. Another quote from Calvin I really like is, he says that God has not anointed gold for rust, nor garments for moths, but on the contrary, he has designated them as aids to help to human life. I love that. So he's actually saying that those good gifts are meant to be shared, and it's good. It's good when you can see somebody that's cold and you can give them your jacket. It's good when somebody's hungry and you can give them food. There's a sense in which food is actually meant to be enjoyed like that. There's nothing wrong with taking pleasure in life, but there's a way that these things get misused where we're hoarding them for ourselves, and we laugh in that Old Testament sense I talked about last week. Laugh in the way that we don't care about the rest of the world and we hoard to ourselves, and we have no care of what's going to happen in the last day, how God could judge our actions. We're just trying to get as much pleasure out of life now. And when James says where does he say it? You have laid up treasures in the last days. Behold the wages of the laborers. I think the idea is that they are hoarding up those things very now. I think last days very often in the New Testament means now. The New Testament authors believe they were in the last days. The last days have gone from then until now. We're still in the last days. And so I think the idea is that there's something that's particularly evil about hoarding wealth in the last days. Again, his current time he's writing, because Jesus has been revealed. This is the time of fulfillment, and it's now the kingdom has been inaugurated. It's breaking in. It's not fully consummated, but there's something that's particularly dangerous about hoarding wealth in this time, because now Jesus could return at any time. And any time, these people that have hoarded all these things could fall. I mean, you think of, there's actually something very Jonathan Edwardsy about this section. It reminded me of the verse from "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" from Deuteronomy, which in Old King James says, "Their foot shall slide in due time." And Edwards has this, if you've ever read it, just a brilliant exposition of that just short verse and what that means. Their foot shall slide in due time. It's this idea that any time the rich could just fall off, they could fall down. The only thing keeping them away from hell is God's mercy. And yet it could at any moment bring judgment. And actually, and you think about this verse from the cries of the field, that people that have been the money had been held back in fraud. Look at verse 4. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. Whenever you see Lord of hosts, know that the author is trying to signal a kind of judgment. It's God of armies. He has this vast army of angels, and they're not just these cuddly, little babies with wings. They are ready for battle. They are ready to carry out God's purposes. And it's supposed to bring terror for these people that have been hoarding all this wealth. But I think it's supposed to bring comfort to people who have been wronged, because they can know that God is going to bring perfect justice. And think about the way that this is written, that the cries against you are reached the ears. I think it's this idea that nothing is going to be forgotten. Every dime that is spent sinfully will not go unpunished. There's a record of that God is keeping hold of, and he is not going to forget a single sin. Now, this should scare us in some sense, right? Again, I think that this is directed more towards unbelievers, right? I mean, there's much that could be said for grace and justification. We're not saved just simply because we don't do these things. Many people who are true believers will slip into this in their own way, I'm sure. But when this group is judged, they will be presented with these things. They will stand before God and have to give an account for these sins. You wonder when James says that these people have committed murder and they've murdered the righteous person in verse 6. Some people have suggested, and it's actually totally plausible, that James could possibly know, and maybe he's talking about Jesus. James could possibly have people in his church, think about this, who were in the very crowds that said, crucify Jesus. Those people could have joined the Jerusalem church very likely, and James could know them. How crazy is that? I think it's more likely that he's speaking about murder in a more general sense. You think about anger as murder in James's writing very often, but it's this very general sense. And if you're somebody who's rich and you're withholding money from the poor, in a very real sense, you are murdering them because it's their livelihood. People can starve if they're not given money. And, I think it's even more interesting when you consider the way that James, the James that we believe wrote this book, was pushed off the top of the tent pole by the Jewish leaders. And you think of James in some ways as prophetically is writing about himself. He does not resist you. James was put to death by the Jewish authorities. And it's very possible too, I forgot to mention this, but it's very possible that a lot of the people that he's thinking about are the Jewish leaders and rich people in the community who probably have not accepted Jesus, but they're also holding on their wealth. They know that to accept Christ would actually be a rejection of their wealth. There's a marginalization that would have taken place in these communities. And we know from history that the land in Palestine was becoming more and more concentrated in the hands of a very small few elite, wealthy Jews who actually own this land, and the kinds of things that James talks about. And again, he's just so graphic in this passage. You think about verse 5, you fatten your hearts in the day of slaughter. He is likening these people to an animal that is fattening. And there's this sense, you almost get this feeling of there's an almost eagerness to just carry out that justice. And why is that? It's because God hates sin. He hates fraud. He hates the persecution that the rich bring on his people, the poor. And so sometimes I think we struggle with the idea of this anger. People say, I hate fire and brimstone preaching. But I think that we ought to remember that this is a God who hates injustice. He hates when people are taken advantage of. And I think we often say we want a merciful God, we want a God who just doesn't care. Well, a God who doesn't care about my sins is not going to care about those other sins that I'm very mad about. And so when we're angry at the world and we're angry about all the injustice in the world, if we don't have a God who wants to bring out ultimate justice, then it's on us to take care of it. But what does God say? God is the Lord of hosts. He is going to take care of this. So it's a comfort to us who are being persecuted, and it is also a warning to us lest we fall into this. I want to leave you with one last question, which is, how does the knowledge of God's judgment for the unrighteous help us now? And I'll let you think about that. But like I said, I think it helps us to know that God is going to bring out and carry ultimate justice for these acts of injustice in the end. But think about that. I hope it helps you in your discipleship and in your life. Well, this is the second to last episode. I don't know if I should say episode, session on James. I hope you got a lot out of this. Next week will be our last session. So we look forward to seeing you then.